8 months after 2 little girls vanished from a paradise beach, a pilot spots a child's desperate signal on an uncharted island. What he uncovers there is a truth far more terrifying than anyone imagined. The laughter, light and effervescent as the sea foam itself, was the first thing to vanish. One moment it was there, a melody weaving through the rhythmic crash of turquoise waves against the pristine white sands of Viridian Cove. The next, an unnerving silence that pricked at Sarah Bennett's skin, colder than the onshore breeze. It was the 17th of April, a day that had dawned with the golden promise of a perfect family holiday, the kind splashed across glossy travel brochures. Now, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, that promise was fracturing into a million jagged pieces. Emily, her 4-year-old, with a mop of sunshine yellow curls, and Sophie, the more reserved 6-year-old with eyes the color of the deep ocean, had been building a sandcastle. Not just any sandcastle, but an elaborate fortress complete with seashell ramparts and a seaweed flag, their tiny hands working with a fierce, shared concentration that always melted Sarah's heart. She'd turned away for no more than 5 minutes, a brief interlude to reapply sunscreen and retrieve a bottle of water from their beach bag, tucked beneath the shade of a rustling palm tree. The girls were only 20 yards away, a comfortable distance, well within her line of sight. Or so she had thought. When she looked back, the half-finished sandcastle stood forlorn, its seaweed flag drooping as if in mourning. The beach, moments before alive with the squeals and chatter of her daughters, was now populated only by a few scattered couples and the distant figures of resort staff raking away the day's debris. A sudden visceral terror, cold and sharp, pierced through Sarah. Her breath hitched. Emily? Sophie? Her voice was a strained whisper at first, barely audible above the surf. She scanned the shoreline, her gaze frantic, sweeping from the water's edge to the dense thicket of palm trees bordering the resort property. Nothing. Just the endless expanse of sand, the indifferent ocean, and the deepening shadows. Panic began to claw its way up her throat, constricting her chest. Emily. Sophie. This time her voice was louder, sharper, laced with a rising hysteria that turned heads. Other beachgoers paused, their relaxed holiday expressions morphing into looks of concern, then alarm. Sarah ran towards the water, her bare feet sinking into the damp sand, her eyes darting wildly. Had they gone for a paddle? But they knew the rule: never near the water without Mommy. The waves, once inviting, now seemed menacing, capable of snatching small bodies and pulling them into their depths. She screamed their names again and again, each cry more desperate than the last, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the beach. Her husband, Mark, had taken the resort's jet ski out for a quick spin just half an hour earlier, a rare moment of solo indulgence. He was due back any minute. The thought of facing him, of telling him, was an agony too immense to comprehend. But first, she had to find them. They had to be close. They had to be. Resort security was alerted within minutes, their crisp, impersonal efficiency a stark contrast to Sarah's unraveling composure. Search parties fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. Questions were asked, descriptions given. Emily in her bright pink swimsuit with the frilly skirt, Sophie in her blue one-piece, adorned with tiny silver fish. Sarah clutched Emily's abandoned sun hat, a small, floppy straw hat with a daisy chain embroidered around the brim, its cheerful design, a cruel mockery of the situation. This hat, smelling faintly of sunshine and her daughter's hair, became her anchor in the storm of her despair. Witnesses were scarce and their accounts vague. A couple thought they'd seen 2 little girls heading towards the more secluded northern end of the cove, near the rocky outcrops. Another reported seeing a small, unmarked seaplane take off from the water around that time, an unusual occurrence for this particular resort, which primarily catered to yacht arrivals. The detail about the seaplane, initially dismissed as irrelevant by the local police, lodged itself in Sarah's mind like a sliver of ice. Seaplanes. Who used seaplanes for a casual beach visit? The hours bled into a nightmarish blur. The local police, initially sympathetic, soon adopted a tone that hinted at parental negligence. Had she been drinking? Was she distracted? The questions, though routine, felt like accusations, each one twisting the knife of her guilt and fear. Mark returned to a scene of controlled chaos, his sun-kissed face paling to a ghastly white as the reality of the situation crashed down upon him. His earlier joy on the jet ski was now a bitter memory, a stolen moment of freedom that had cost them everything. The initial search yielded nothing, no footprints leading away from their last known location, except for Sarah's own frantic ones. No discarded toys, no stray articles of clothing beyond the sun hat. It was as if Emily and Sophie had simply evaporated, spirited away by the ocean breeze. As dawn broke, casting a pale, indifferent light over Viridian Cove, the beautiful resort transformed. The swaying palm trees seemed to whisper sinister secrets. The turquoise water concealed a dark, unfathomable void. The gilded cage of paradise had revealed its hidden, terrifying teeth. The question, immense and unanswerable, hung heavy in the salt-laden air. Where were Emily and Sophie Bennet? And who or what had taken them from a crowded beach in broad daylight, leaving behind only a half-built sandcastle and a mother's shattered heart? The seaplane. The image of it lifting off the water, sleek and anonymous, became an obsessive, tormenting fixture in Sarah's mind. It was too clean, too precise for a simple, tragic accident. This felt orchestrated. 8 months. 243 days. Each one a fresh layer of grit beneath Sarah Bennet's eyelids, a testament to sleepless nights, and a grief so profound it had become a part of her very marrow. The vibrant, sun-kissed woman who had arrived at Viridian Cove had been eroded, replaced by a gaunt figure with shadows cupped beneath eyes that burned with a feverish, unwavering intensity. Her once stylish blonde hair was now often scraped back in a severe ponytail, practicality having long since trumped vanity. The luxurious suburban home she and Mark had once shared felt cavernous, each empty room echoing with the ghosts of laughter and tiny footsteps. Mark was still there, physically, but their shared trauma had become a chasm between them, unspoken accusations and divergent grieving processes, carving out separate islands of sorrow. He sought solace in stoic silence and long hours at work. Sarah poured every ounce of her being into the singular, all-consuming mission: find Emily and Sophie. What was lost was not just the physical presence of her daughters, it was the future she had meticulously planned, the school plays she would never attend, the teenage dramas she would never navigate, the weddings she would never weep at. It was the easy camaraderie of motherhood, now replaced by pitying glances and awkward silences from former friends who didn't know how to bridge the abyss of her pain. Her faith in the inherent goodness of the world had been shattered, leaving behind a cynical pragmatism. The world was not safe. It was a place where children could be plucked from a crowded beach like seashells. Her small home office, once a cheerful space for managing household finances and planning family outings, had been transformed into a war room. Walls were plastered with maps of Viridian Cove and the surrounding archipelago, flight paths of small aircraft, and grainy printouts of seaplane models. Files overflowed with police reports, witness statements, or the frustrating lack thereof, and correspondence with private investigators she'd hired and fired when their expensive efforts yielded nothing but hollow reassurances. She had become an expert in maritime charts and aviation forums, her search history a litany of obscure island chains and clandestine airstrips. The police, while initially active, had long since relegated the Bennett case to the cold case files, their resources stretched thin, their initial leads having evaporated like morning mist. The official narrative leaned towards a tragic, if improbable, drowning, despite the lack of bodies and Sarah's persistent, almost hysterical insistence on the seaplane. The sun hat, Emily's floppy straw hat, sat on the corner of her desk, encased in a clear protective box like a sacred relic. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the silence of the house pressed in on her, she would open the box and hold the hat, pressing it to her face, trying to conjure the scent of her daughter, the faint, sweet smell of sunshine and innocence. It was a ritual of both comfort and exquisite pain. Beside it lay Sophie's last drawing, a vibrant crayon depiction of their family, all four of them holding hands under a smiling sun, a poignant artifact of a life that felt a lifetime ago. It was during one of her relentless online trawls, deep in a forum for freelance bush pilots and reconnaissance flyers, that she first encountered the name Captain Dean Rogers. He was a veteran pilot, known for taking on unconventional survey jobs in remote Pacific regions. His posts, though infrequent, were pragmatic and detailed, Speaking of a man who knew the skies and the isolated pockets of the world intimately, Sarah, armed with a desperation that bulldozed through social niceties, tracked down his contact information. Her initial email was a torrent of information, a plea, a demand for help from a system that had all but given up. She'd attached the girl's photos, the police report, and her own meticulously compiled notes on the seaplane sighting, highlighting the approximate time and the vague description provided: small, twin-engine, possibly dark blue or grey. To her surprise, Rogers responded. His reply was terse, devoid of sentimentality, but it contained a crucial element. He didn't dismiss her. He asked for specific meteorological data from the day of the disappearance, inquired about prevailing currents around Viridian Cove, and most importantly, asked for any further details, however insignificant they might seem, about the seaplane. He explained that many uninhabited islands in the region had old, overgrown landing strips from previous, less scrupulous enterprises, or natural lagoons suitable for seaplane landings. He made no promises, but he agreed to keep her information on file and an eye out during his regular survey flights over less trafficked archipelagos. It was a sliver of hope, so thin it was almost invisible, yet Sarah clung to it with the tenacity of a drowning woman. She remembered Emily's boundless energy, her ability to make friends with anyone, her infectious giggle that could fill a room. Sophie, quieter and more observant, possessed an old soul's wisdom, her drawings filled with an intricate detail that belied her age. Emily would be 5 now, Sophie nearly 7. What would they look like? Had their captors been kind? The questions were a constant, agonizing hum beneath the surface of her daily tasks. She forced herself to eat, to sleep in snatches, driven by the conviction that her daughters were alive, waiting for her. She had to be strong for them. The memory of the seaplane was a recurring nightmare. In her dreams, it was a predatory bird, its engines a menacing roar, its shadow falling over her unsuspecting children. The police had found no record of unscheduled flights matching the description. No flight plan filed, no distress calls. It was a ghost. But Sarah knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that the seaplane was the key. Someone, somewhere, knew something about that aircraft. One bleak November afternoon, 8 months after the girls vanished, as rain lashed against her office window, mirroring the storm within her, an email landed in her inbox. The sender, Dean Rogers. The subject line, possible visual, uncharted island, Sector 7G. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. With trembling hands, she clicked it open. The email was brief, factual. Rogers had been on a routine coastal erosion survey when he'd diverted slightly due to a squall. He'd passed over a small, densely forested and supposedly uninhabited island, one not even marked on most modern charts, roughly 400 nautical miles northwest of Viridian Cove. Standard procedure was to log any anomalies. He had seen something. From altitude, through a break in the clouds, he'd spotted what looked like a makeshift signal fire, recently extinguished. And then, more chillingly, a flash of color that didn't belong. A bright pink, almost identical to the shade of the swimsuit Emily had been wearing, spread out on a rocky outcrop as if to dry, or to be seen. The words on Sarah's screen, possible visual, uncharted island, Sector 7G, pulsed with a life of their own. Each letter a tiny spark, igniting a wildfire of hope, so fierce it momentarily consumed the gnawing despair that had been her constant companion. Her hands trembled so violently that the mouse skittered across the desk. A sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped her lips. For a breathless moment, she could almost feel Emily's small hand in hers, smell Sophie's freshly washed hair. The flash of pink, it had to be Emily's swimsuit. It was too specific, too potent a detail to be mere coincidence, after 8 agonizing months of nothing. Her first call was to Detective Miller, the lead investigator on the original case at the Viridian Cove precinct, or rather, the detective who had inherited the rapidly cooling file. She'd learned his direct extension by heart, a grim memento of countless fruitless calls. This time, however, her voice was not the weary monotone he was accustomed to. It was urgent, alive, crackling with a desperate conviction. She read Roger's email verbatim, her words tumbling out, painting a picture of the remote island, the signal fire, the crucial flash of pink. The silence on the other end of the line stretched, heavy and suffocating. When Miller finally spoke, his tone was one of weary patience, the kind reserved for well-meaning but ultimately misguided civilians. "Mrs. Bennett," he began, his voice flat, "I understand your excitement, truly. But a possible visual from a pilot over an uncharted island, based on a flash of color, it's thin, very thin." "Thin?" Sarah's voice rose, incredulous. "Detective, this is the first tangible lead we've had in 8 months. Captain Rogers is a reputable pilot. He saw what he saw. A signal fire suggests someone is alive, trying to be found. The pink fabric could be anything, Mrs. Bennett. A discarded fishing net, a piece of debris washed ashore. These small islands, even uncharted ones, are often used by smugglers, illegal fishermen. They leave all sorts of things behind." Miller's pragmatism felt like a physical blow. "Sector 7G, you said. That's well outside our primary search radius, hundreds of miles, and likely outside our jurisdiction without more substantial evidence. We can't just dispatch a search team, a Coast Guard vessel based on this alone. Resources are already stretched." Sarah's hope, so vibrant moments before, began to fray. "So, what are you suggesting? That we do nothing? That we ignore this because it's inconvenient?" The familiar chill of systemic indifference crept over her. "I'm suggesting we need more," Miller stated, his voice firming. "Does Captain Rogers have photographic evidence? Coordinates precise enough for a formal investigation? Can he definitively say he saw children, or even people?" She contacted Dean Rogers immediately. He was sympathetic but confirmed the limitations of his sighting. He'd been battling a squall. His priority had been navigating his aircraft safely. The sighting was fleeting, through a momentary break in dense cloud cover, at altitude. He had the GPS coordinates of the island, of course, logged meticulously as was his habit, but no high-resolution photographs of the pink object or the extinguished fire. He couldn't swear he'd seen people, only that the signs were consistent with a possible need for rescue, and the pink was an anomaly that had struck him given the information Sarah had previously provided. He offered to file an official report of his sighting with the relevant maritime authorities, but cautioned her that without more, it would likely be logged and forgotten. Days turned into a week. Sarah forwarded Rogers' official report, along with a desperate, impassioned plea to every conceivable authority, the local police, the National Coast Guard, even her state representative. The responses, when they came, were a bureaucratic symphony of deflection and delay. "The matter is under review. We are assessing the information. Jurisdictional complexities require further consultation." It was a labyrinth designed to exhaust and deter. The system, it seemed, was more concerned with protocol and resource allocation than with the possibility, however slim, of rescuing 2 little girls. Mark, when she showed him Rogers' email, had reacted with a surge of hope that quickly deflated upon hearing the authorities' lukewarm response. He'd been burned by false dawns before, by private investigators who promised the world and delivered only invoices. "Sarah, I want to believe this. More than anything," he'd said, his face etched with a familiar pain. "But what if it's just another dead end, another way to tear ourselves apart? We need to be realistic." His realism felt like a betrayal, though she knew it stemmed from his own deep well of grief and a desperate need to protect himself from further heartbreak. The injustice was a bitter pill. If this had been the child of a politician, a celebrity, would the response have been so muted? Would jurisdictional complexities have stood in the way of a full-scale search? The media, once frenzied in the initial weeks, had long since moved on to fresher tragedies. Emily and Sophie were old news, their faces fading from public consciousness, relegated to the occasional on this day human interest filler. One particularly frustrating afternoon, after a call with a Coast Guard lieutenant who condescendingly explained the prohibitive cost of deploying a cutter to an uncharted island for what he termed a speculative sighting, Sarah slammed the phone down. The polite indifference, the careful, non-committal language, it was all designed to manage her, to placate her, not to help her. She looked at the maps on her wall, the image of that lonely, unnamed island now burned into her mind. If the system wouldn't act, if the world had decided her daughters were a lost cause, then she would have to find another way. She emailed Rogers again, a new, steely resolve hardening within her. She didn't ask him to convince the authorities. She asked him something else entirely. "Captain Rogers," she typed, her fingers steady, "you mentioned that some of these islands have old landing strips or lagoons suitable for seaplanes. This island you saw, is it accessible by a small aircraft? If one were to, hypothetically, charter a private flight for a closer look, would it be feasible?" The thought was terrifying. It was reckless. It would cost money they didn't have, deplete the dwindling funds they'd set aside for the girl's future, a future that seemed to recede with each passing day. But the alternative, to sit and wait for a system that had already failed them, to let this one fragile sliver of hope dissolve into the ether, was unbearable. The image of Emily's pink swimsuit, a tiny flag of distress on a forgotten island, was too powerful to ignore. The labyrinth of indifference had only strengthened her resolve. If no one else would go, she would find a way. She had to. Captain Dean Rogers' reply was swift and practical. Yes, the island, which he had provisionally dubbed Ethel's Rest, after a stubborn old aunt who also refused to be mapped, had a small, somewhat sheltered lagoon on its leeward side. It would be a risky landing for his twin-engine amphibian, a Grumman Widgeon, requiring precise piloting and calm seas, but it was feasible. He quoted a price for a 2-day charter, fuel, supplies, his time, and the inherent danger. It was a staggering sum, one that would liquidate the last of their savings, money earmarked for university educations that now seemed like a cruel joke. Sarah presented the figures to Mark. His face, already etched with lines of worry that hadn't been there a year ago, tightened. "Sarah, this is everything we have left. What if he finds nothing? What if it is just a piece of cloth? And what if it isn't?" she countered, her voice low and fierce, the desperation a raw wound. "What if Emily is there, waiting? What if Sophie is? Can we live with ourselves if we don't even try, if we let this one chance slip away because of money?" She saw the conflict in his eyes, the pragmatist warring with the father. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a reminder of stolen time. Then a memory surfaced, unbidden, sharp as a shard of glass. It was from the morning of the disappearance, just hours before. They were having breakfast on the resort balcony, the girls giggling as a bold seagull eyed Emily's toast. Sophie, ever the artist, was sketching in a small notepad, a new one bought specially for the holiday. She'd looked up, her brow furrowed, and pointed towards a sleek, dark-hulled yacht, anchored further out in the bay than most of the other pleasure craft. "Mommy," she'd said, her voice small, "why does that boat have no name?" Sarah had glanced at it, registered its anonymous opulence, and dismissed it. "Some people like to be private, sweetie." Now, the memory snagged. An expensive, unnamed yacht, present on the day of the abduction. Could there be a connection to the equally anonymous seaplane? It was tenuous, a wisp of a thought, but it added another layer to her unease, another reason to push forward. Mark finally sighed, the sound heavy with resignation and a flicker of rekindled hope he couldn't quite extinguish. "Okay," he said, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Okay, Sarah, we do it. But I'm coming with you." The preparations were a whirlwind of logistics and suppressed fear. Sarah packed a small duffel bag, changes of clothes, first aid supplies, high-energy food bars, and, tucked into a side pocket, Emily's sun hat and Sophie's drawing. They were talismans, tangible links to the children she was fighting to reclaim. As she packed, another memory flickered, this one from weeks before the holiday. They had been at a local park. Emily had been on the swings, her laughter echoing, when Sarah noticed a man sitting on a bench nearby. He wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, just reading a newspaper, but she'd felt a prickle of unease. He seemed too focused, not on his paper, but in the general direction of the children's play area. When she'd looked again, he was gone. At the time, she'd dismissed it as an overactive maternal instinct. Now, it felt sinister, a possible piece of a much larger, horrifying puzzle. Had they been watched? Targeted even before Viridian Cove? The thought made her feel physically ill. Captain Rogers met them at a small, private airfield a few hours' drive from their home. He was a man weathered by sun and wind, his eyes narrowed from years of scanning horizons, but they held a quiet competence that inspired a fragile confidence. His Grumman Widgeon, though an older aircraft, was impeccably maintained. She's a reliable bird, he said, patting its fuselage. Seen worse than Athel's Rest, I reckon. The flight was long, 8 hours over an endless, featureless expanse of the Pacific. Below them, the ocean shifted from sapphire to a deep, brooding grey as they flew further from civilization. Mark was quiet, staring out the window, his knuckles white where he gripped the armrest. Sarah found herself drifting back to the witness account of the seaplane at Viridian Cove. Small, twin-engine, possibly dark blue or grey. The description was so generic, but one detail, mentioned almost as an afterthought by the elderly tourist who'd reported it, now echoed in her mind. The tourist had said it looked military-like, but too small. What did that mean? Had it been a specific type of aircraft? Not just any seaplane? She made a mental note to ask Rogers about aircraft that fit that description. As they approached the coordinates Rogers had logged, the tension in the small cabin became almost unbearable. Then, through a break in the scattered clouds, Athel's Rest appeared. It was exactly as Rogers had described. Small, densely forested, a volcanic peak rising from the turquoise water, fringed by a narrow beach and forbidding black rocks. It looked utterly desolate, untouched by human hands. Sarah's heart sank a little. Could anyone survive here? Rogers circled the island once, twice, his experienced eyes scanning every visible inch. Lagoon is on the western side, as I remembered, he said, his voice calm over the headset. Wind looks manageable for an approach. See that rocky outcrop to the north of the lagoon? That's where I saw the flash of pink. Sarah strained her eyes, her face pressed against the Perspex window. And then she saw it. Not just the pink, which was still there, a vivid splash of color against the dull grey rock, but something else, something that made her blood run cold. Near the pink fabric, partially concealed by a tangle of vines at the edge of the tree line, was a glint of metal. It was too regular, too structured to be natural. As Rogers banked the widgeon for a closer pass, the shape resolved itself. It was the tail section of a small aircraft, crumpled and dark, blending almost perfectly with the shadows of the jungle. It looked like a wreck. "Captain," Sarah breathed, her voice barely a whisper, pointing, "Down there, by the trees." Rogers followed her gaze. His expression, usually unreadable, tightened. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, adjusting his course slightly. "That wasn't there during my last pass. Or if it was completely obscured. Looks like a recent crash, or a well-hidden one. A crashed plane, on an uninhabited island where her daughter's swimsuit lay. The implications were terrifying. Were her girls on that plane? Had there been an accident after the abduction? Or was this something else entirely? Something even more sinister? The questions multiplied, each more horrifying than the last. The military-like comment about the seaplane at Viridian Cove suddenly felt chillingly relevant. The hope that had carried her this far now wrestled with a new, sickening dread. They were not just looking for lost children anymore. They were flying towards a mystery that had just become infinitely more dangerous. The Grumman widgeon settled into the calm, turquoise waters of the lagoon with a gentle splash, the engines winding down to a throaty gurgle. Athel's Rest was eerily silent, the only sounds the lapping of water against the hull and the distant cries of unseen seabirds. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the island's primeval stillness. Mark, his face pale but resolute, unlatched the cabin door. Captain Rogers, already out on the pontoon, secured the aircraft to a sturdy, low-hanging branch of a mangrove tree. "All right," Rogers said, his voice low. "Let's be cautious. We don't know who or what else might be here. Stick together." He unclipped a heavy-duty machete from his belt, its blade glinting dully in the filtered sunlight. He also carried a satellite phone and a basic emergency kit. The trek from the lagoon towards the rocky outcrop where the pink fabric lay, and beyond it, the newly spotted wreckage, was arduous. The jungle pressed in on them, a suffocating green wall of tangled vines, massive ferns, and ancient trees whose roots snaked across the forest floor like petrified serpents. The ground was uneven, slick with mud in places. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, sent jolts of adrenaline through Sarah. It took them nearly 30 minutes to reach the outcrop, and there it was, Emily's pink swimsuit, faded by the sun and salt, stained with grime, but unmistakably hers. Sarah stumbled forward, a choked cry escaping her. She snatched it up, pressing the damp, gritty fabric to her face, a sob racking her frame. It smelled of mildew and the sea, but beneath it, she imagined, she willed herself to detect the faintest, lingering trace of her daughter. Mark put a trembling arm around her, his own eyes wet. "She was here, Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "She was here." Rogers, while giving them a moment, scanned their surroundings, his gaze sharp and assessing. "The plane wreck is just beyond those palms," he indicated with the machete. "Let's see what that tells us." The wreckage was more substantial than it had appeared from the air, though still relatively small. A single-engine aircraft, not a seaplane, its fuselage crumpled like a discarded can, its wings sheared off. It was a high-wing monoplane, perhaps a Cessna or similar, painted a nondescript white with faded blue striping. It was definitely not the dark, military-like twin-engine seaplane described by the witness at Viridian Cove. A wave of confusion washed over Sarah. This wasn't their plane. "This isn't it," Mark said, voicing her thoughts. "This isn't the seaplane they talked about." "No, it's not," Rogers confirmed, carefully circling the wreckage. "Looks like it came down hard, maybe a week or two ago at most. Engine failure, perhaps, or bad weather." He peered into the shattered cockpit. No bodies. A flicker of something, not quite relief because the girls were still missing, but a lessening of one specific, horrifying scenario, passed through Sarah. Her daughters hadn't been in this crash. But then, why was Emily's swimsuit here? So close to it. They began a more systematic search of the immediate area around the downed aircraft. Rogers, with his experience, pointed out signs of recent activity. Broken branches, faint scuff marks on the rocks that weren't natural. Inside the plane's small cargo hold, which had burst open on impact, they found a few waterlogged crates. Prying one open, Mark revealed not personal belongings, but what looked like sophisticated electronic equipment, now mostly smashed and corroded. Another crate contained bundled satellite maps of various remote archipelagos and what appeared to be geological survey tools. There were no clothes, no food supplies beyond a few scattered ration bars, no identification. "Smugglers? Illegal surveyors?" Mark muttered, looking at Rogers. "Could be," Rogers replied, his expression thoughtful. "Or something else entirely. Whoever they weren't your average tourists." He pointed to a small, heavy-duty Pelican case wedged beneath a twisted seat. It was locked. As Rogers worked to pry open the case, Sarah felt a growing unease. The presence of this second, unrelated crash site was deeply unsettling. It complicated everything. Was it a grotesque coincidence? Or was this island some kind of magnet for disaster, a forgotten corner of the world where tragedies piled upon each other? Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the jungle from somewhere deeper inland, like a branch snapping underfoot, but louder, more deliberate. All three of them froze. Rogers silenced his efforts on the case, his head cocked, listening. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than before. "Company," Rogers mouthed, his eyes narrowed. He motioned for Sarah and Mark to stay low, behind the bulk of the wrecked fuselage. Seconds later, two figures emerged from the dense tree line, about 50 yards away, moving cautiously towards the wreckage, clearly drawn by the sounds Rogers had been making. They were men, gaunt and disheveled, their clothes torn and stained. One was tall and powerfully built, though he moved with a slight limp. The other was shorter, wiry, with a suspicious, darting gaze. They carried no visible weapons, but their appearance was wild, desperate. They stopped short when they saw Sarah, Mark, and Rogers. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension a palpable force. The taller man spoke first, his voice raspy. Who are you? What are you doing here?" He had an accent Sarah couldn't quite place, perhaps Eastern European. "We could ask you the same thing," Rogers responded, his tone even but firm, his hand resting near the machete on his belt. This was our plane," the shorter man said, gesturing vaguely at the wreckage, his eyes flicking between the three newcomers. Sarah's mind raced. These were the survivors of this crash. But then, the swimsuit, the pink swimsuit, she blurted out, unable to contain herself. The child's swimsuit on the rocks. "Was it yours? Did you find a child?" The two men exchanged a quick, unreadable glance. It was the taller one who answered, his gaze shifting to the pink fabric Sarah still clutched. The pink cloth? No, not ours. We found that. Found it where? Mark pressed, stepping forward. Near the other one, the man said, his eyes now holding a strange mixture of fear and something else. Calculation? Other one, Sarah whispered. Other what? The other. Crash, the tall man clarified, nodding slowly. The seaplane, dark color, over on the north shore, smashed on the reef. We found the pink cloth there, washed up near it. We thought, if someone came looking, it was bright. A signal. Sarah felt the world tilt. A second crash site. The original seaplane, the one from Viridian Cove. Her knees went weak, and Mark had to steady her. The kidnapper's plane had crashed too. You saw it? The seaplane? Rogers interjected, his voice sharp with urgency. How long ago? Maybe 10 days. 12 days ago we found it, the shorter man chimed in. We crashed 2 weeks back. We've been looking for a way off. Were there children? Sarah forced the words out, her throat tight with a terrifying hope. At the seaplane crash? Did you see children? 2 little girls? The tall man hesitated, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second before meeting hers. We saw signs, he said slowly. Small footprints in the sand, near the wreckage, leading away from it, into the jungle. But the tide, it washed much away. And the jungle, it's not safe. He paused, then added, his voice dropping ominously. This island, it has others. Not just us. We've seen them. Watching. Before Sarah could process this new, horrifying layer, that her daughters had potentially survived a plane crash, only to wander into a jungle possibly inhabited by other unknown individuals. The shorter man, who had been nervously scanning the tree line behind Sarah, Mark and Rogers, suddenly stiffened. His eyes widened in genuine terror. They come, he hissed, pointing past them. They are here. Sarah spun around. Emerging from the dense undergrowth, moving with a silence that was deeply unsettling, were 3 more figures. These were not like the 2 ragged survivors. These individuals were dressed in dark, functional clothing, their faces obscured by shadows and what looked like makeshift masks. And unlike the crash survivors, these newcomers were armed, carrying what appeared to be crude spears or sharpened staves, and one held a long, rusty-looking knife. They fanned out, their movements practiced, blocking any obvious retreat towards the lagoon. The island's deceptive heart had just revealed another, far more menacing, secret. The air crackled, thick with unspoken threats. The 3 newcomers, their faces shadowed and inscrutable behind their crude masks, advanced slowly, their movements fluid and predatory. The rusty knife held by the leader glinted menacingly. Behind Sarah, the 2 plane crash survivors, the tall one and the wiry one, seemed to shrink, their earlier bravado evaporating into palpable fear. They clearly knew, and feared, these armed islanders. Who are you? Roger's voice cut through the tension, calm but authoritative. He didn't reach for his machete, but his hand hovered near. We mean no harm. We are looking for 2 little girls. The leader of the armed group, a stocky man whose eyes, visible through slits in his mask, were dark and assessing, tilted his head. He uttered something in a language Sarah didn't recognize, a series of guttural clicks and soft sibilants. It wasn't Spanish, nor any common Pacific dialect she'd ever heard. Sarah's heart pounded. This was a barrier she hadn't anticipated, a language divide on top of everything else. But maternal desperation transcended language. She fumbled in her duffel bag, her hands shaking, and pulled out Sophie's drawing, the vibrant crayon picture of their family under the smiling sun. She held it up, her gaze pleading with the masked leader. Children, she said, her voice trembling but clear. Girls. Emily. Sophie. She pointed to the small figures in the drawing, then to herself and Mark. My children. The masked man's eyes flickered to the drawing, then back to Sarah. For a moment, nothing changed in his stance. Then, one of the other armed men, younger, slighter, shifted his weight. From the folds of his dark tunic, something fell to the ground. A small, crudely carved wooden bird, no bigger than Sarah's thumb, polished smooth as if by constant handling. It looked like a child's toy. Before anyone could react, the tall survivor of the Cessna crash suddenly lunged, not at the armed islanders, but towards the Pelican case Rogers had been trying to open near the wreckage. The GPS unit. "It's our only way," he yelled, his accent thick with panic. His wiry companion, seeing his chance, bolted in the opposite direction, scrambling back towards the denser part of the jungle. The sudden movement broke the fragile standoff. The armed islanders tensed, their weapons coming up. The leader barked an order. Rogers moved instantly, not to fight, but to position himself between Sarah and Mark and the perceived threat, his machete now firmly in hand. "Stay back," he warned. But the masked leader wasn't focused on Rogers. His dark eyes were fixed on Sarah, and on the drawing she still held aloft. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. He pointed at the drawing, then at himself, and then gestured deeper into the island's interior. He repeated a word, softer this time, "Keiki." Then again, pointing at Sophie's drawing, "Keiki." A memory flashed through Sarah's mind, a travel documentary about Hawaii she'd watched years ago. Keiki, the Hawaiian word for child. It wasn't an exact match to his dialect, but the implication was unmistakable. He understood. Just then, from the direction the leader was gesturing, a faint sound drifted through the trees, a child's voice, singing a slightly off-key, repetitive little tune. It was a song Emily had been obsessed with for weeks before the trip, a silly jingle from a cartoon. Sarah's breath hitched, her blood turned to ice, then fire. "Emily?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Ignoring Mark's restraining hand, ignoring Rogers' shouted caution, Sarah broke away and stumbled towards the sound, crashing through the undergrowth, Sophie's drawing still clutched in her hand. "Emily!" "Sophie!" The masked leader didn't try to stop her. He watched her go, then said something to his companions, who lowered their weapons slightly, their stance becoming less aggressive, more watchful. Sarah burst into a small clearing, and there they were. Emily, her sunshine yellow curls matted with leaves and dirt, her pink swimsuit, the one from the rock, now supplemented with a crudely fashioned skirt of woven grasses, was sitting on a log, meticulously arranging a line of shiny pebbles. Beside her, Sophie, her deep ocean eyes wide and serious, was using a charred stick to draw figures in the dirt, remarkably detailed sketches of birds and trees. They were thinner, undeniably wilder, their skin tanned and scratched, but they were alive. They were whole. "Emily! Sophie!" Sarah cried, collapsing to her knees, tears streaming down her face. The girls looked up, their eyes widening, not in immediate recognition, but in startled curiosity at this strange, sobbing woman. 8 months was an eternity in a child's life. Then Emily's gaze fell on the drawing in Sarah's hand. Her small brow furrowed. She pointed a grubby finger. "Mommy?" The word was a hesitant question, a forgotten melody slowly recalled. Sophie scrambled to her feet, her eyes fixed on Sarah's face, then on Mark, who had followed, Rogers close behind him, the tension in their shoulders easing almost imperceptibly as they took in the scene. "Daddy?" Sophie whispered. And then the dam broke. Recognition, raw and overwhelming, flooded their faces. "Mommy! Daddy!" They ran, small bare feet flying over the uneven ground, and launched themselves into Sarah and Mark's outstretched arms. The world contracted to that single, fierce embrace, the scent of unwashed hair and earthy dampness, the sweetest perfume Sarah had ever known. She held them so tightly she feared they might break, yet she could never hold them tight enough. The masked islanders had followed, standing at the edge of the clearing. The leader removed his mask. His face was weathered, kind, his eyes holding a deep sadness, but also a gentle understanding. He explained, through a combination of gestures, the few English words he knew, and Roger's surprisingly adept ability to interpret, that the seaplane, the Sky canoe, had crashed on the reef during a storm nearly 2 weeks prior. They had found no adult survivors, only the 2 Keiki, terrified but unharmed, near the wreckage. These islanders were a small, reclusive community, descendants of people shipwrecked here generations ago, wary of the outside world that had only ever brought them trouble or exploitation. They had cared for the girls as best they could, seeing their arrival as a sign, perhaps. The pink swimsuit had been placed on the rock as a hopeful signal, should anyone come looking. The 2 men from the Cessna crash, it turned out, were illegal prospectors, searching for rare earth minerals they believed were present on the island. Their plane had crashed due to engine failure. They had stumbled upon the seaplane wreckage and had been trying to salvage equipment, fearful of the islanders. The taller one, who had lunged for the Pelican case, was apprehended by Rogers and Mark. The case contained not just a GPS, but core samples and data related to their illicit survey. His wiry companion had vanished into the jungle. The truth, when it was finally pieced together, was a mosaic of desperation, greed, and unexpected humanity. The original kidnappers, whose identities remained unknown, but were presumed dead in the seaplane crash, had taken the girls for reasons that might never be fully understood. Perhaps a ransom attempt gone wrong, or something connected to the shadowy figures Sarah had vaguely sensed even before the trip. But their motives were now secondary to the overwhelming reality of her daughter's survival. As Captain Rogers used his satellite phone to contact the authorities, relaying their location and the astonishing news, Sarah sat on the forest floor, Emily nestled in her lap, Sophie's head on her shoulder, their small hands clutching hers. The others the Cessna survivor had spoken of were simply these shy, isolated people who had, in their own way, become protectors. The sun hat, battered but present, lay beside her. Sophie's drawing, smeared with dirt and tears, was a testament to a hope that had refused to die. The journey home would be long. There would be questions, investigations, the slow, difficult process of healing. The world outside this remote island, with its complexities and dangers, awaited. But in that moment, under the dappled sunlight of Ethel's Rest, with the soft sounds of the jungle around them and her daughters breathing safely in her arms, Sarah Bennett knew a profound and absolute peace. The lost were found. The truth, in its most vital, life-affirming form, had been exposed. Paradise, once a gilded cage, then a place of terror, had finally, improbably, yielded a miracle.